Welcome to the ongoing saga, which is the Huntington Succulent Plants Symposium. I began working at the Huntington 36 years ago and attended my first symposium, which was the second one ever. And now here we are 36 years later, we're still going, even during what seem to be somewhat apocalyptic times. It's a year I don't think any of us will ever forget. So it's really nice to have you all join us. We're going to put together, I hope, a lively program for you, a simple program. You're welcome to tune in and tune out as your interests lie. We have Sean in a minute will introduce the four speakers, which you might have already noted and seen the sequence of events. You're invited to ask questions. What we're going to do is we're going to go through the programs and entertain a couple of questions between each program, and then save a nice question period at the end. So people who really have other things to do might go ahead and leave, but you're welcome to ask more questions at the end. And your questions are being recorded. So if we don't get to your question, we will have the opportunity to get back to you with an answer at some later date. So today is an interesting time here at the Huntington. We're closed to the public because of the smoke from the fires. We both mourn and celebrate. We celebrate. Today is Sean's birthday. So it's his birthday. I have just recently announced the fact that I'm retiring at the end of the year. So next year there'll be another face in this square. We have this event, and you'll get to meet new people, and we'll get to continue to build associations over the time. But I want to take a minute. My task right now, besides introducing Sean in just a minute, to MC the procedures. My task is to share a screen, and I think I've got the right one. Yep. And our staff of people and volunteers and associates is huge here at the Huntington. And over the years, some people are just with us so long that they seem to be original and part of who we are and what we are as an institution. Just recently, we lost Gary Lyons, and so we're dedicating this symposium to Gary. Gary was a formidable figure in the world of cacti and succulents, and incredibly knowledgeable, native Californian, grew up right here in the region, pretty much knew everything that anybody on this staff would ever know about this collection and about these plants and about the history of the Huntington. Gary came to us in 1965. He was hired by Myron Kimnack. He was hired at the time that William Hertrick was still alive. And Gary was the last person on our staff who both knew Myron, but also worked with William Hertrick. And that has been an important link for us as time went on. Gary was with us until he was lured by bigger things. He left us after many years, went to work independently, designed and landscaped some incredible gardens around the region. Most notably, of course, Gary worked in Las Vegas and designed the FLM Chocolates Garden, a 3-acre garden. It was not just a design, it was a total life experience. He worked out of the office of the owner of the company, Mr. Mars. Ethel M was Mr. Mars's mother, and he was building a garden with Mars that was in memory of Mr. Mars's mother. And his stories of that experience were just incredible, working right in that office and having direct access to the very person who was running Mars Chocolates. And he also designed the garden down at the Avery Ranch, and Gary went on to work with the Los Angeles Zoo and designed several of their landscapes. He continued a huge presence in the world. He was quite a writer, an incredible note taker, and a journalist. Gary journaled his whole life, and in very neat writing, which is something not current anymore today. So you can actually read his notes and read his thoughts and what he was up to. Gary knew more about the history of this desert garden than anybody else, and thankfully he came back to us as curator in 2005 and helped us in our project to get the plants under control. Everything in the garden is photographed, everything in the garden is mapped, And Gary and others participated heavily in trying to make sure that we had all of our provenance correct on those plants. Gary published, he wrote the Huntington book on our desert garden. He gave many symposium talks. He was a fabulous person to walk through the garden with. It was enchanting to hear his stories and his experience out in the garden. And of course, he just seemed to know everybody and remember so much. Gary was member of the Linnean Society. He was a lifelong member of the Cactus and Succulent Society. He was a founding member of the California Landscape and Garden Society. So Gary's contributions and presence will endure for a long, long time because the garden's going to be here, and it is testament to his design acumen, his hard work, and his incredible capacity to not only know about plants but recall about plants and convey his love of plants. I've shown some pictures here as I've been talking. There are pictures of his family up right now and his younger life when he, like many of us, had more hair, and just a remarkable individual and a remarkable legacy that will endure here at the Huntington. And I think that's pretty much what I would like to say. I would like to introduce Sean, who is going to proceed and introduce our speakers, and you'll have a chance to ask questions and hang in. We'll have a nice time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome, everyone. We are really happy you're here. It's so nice to see that tribute to Gary. He really loved our desert collection and the succulents in it, and I think we're all here today because we love them too. So we hope to make this a nice, short and sweet version of our usual symposium. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who will be Gary Roberson. He is the lead project gardener for the Cycad and Palm collection, and he will go next. Gary?
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for inviting me to speak at this symposium. And I'm going to share a little story that I've been involved with for the last 5 years. And that really began with moving the Whitelock Garden. And we see Lauren's Forest of Cycads here in the background. It's probably one of the most iconic collections of Cycads in Los Angeles. And I had the fun job, I guess you could call it fun now, very stressful at the beginning, moving this collection from Eagle Rock to the Huntington. But we get to the companion part, and Lauren was a master at mixing all kinds of plants together, including the succulents, palms, cycads. Here we can see ripsalis and tillandsias, even an orchid in the background. We've got the Diune spinulosum from Oaxaca, Mexico on the right, and in the lower bottom portion, the Stangeria europus from South Africa. And as collectors, we tend to mix things that we like and things that will show well with the cycads. So here we see an aloe hybrid mixed with an Encephalartis whitelockii in South Africa. Other people choose to add a lot of rocks and other companion plants like aloes, agaves, sometimes even begonias. But the rocks also lend architectural structure to the collection itself, and they also help provide drainage. Pete Foster's garden in South Africa, he chose to use a lot of bulbs throughout his garden to mix with ceratizamias, Encephalartis, and he had an occasional friend that would come and visit, his own dog. The botanical gardens tend to present cycads and succulents in a little bit different manner. Their approach is more natural. This is the Crocodile River at the Lowveld National Botanic Gardens in South Africa. And their approach is to leave the grass, add the aloes, add the cycads, keep the trees, and make it more of a habitat experience as you walk through it. Bulbs are succulent, so they get thrown into the mix. They give you good fall color, spring color. Here we see the Scodoxis with villosus, which is a shade-loving cycad. And Kirstenbosch takes a little different approach. They have a lot of grass. They leave the plants in their natural phase as they continue to drop their leaves. They've added succulents as a carpet under many of them. And of course, they brought in their pets as well. Cycads and habitat often take a really mixed collection. They seem to go together really well. They, I guess they really find each other helpful in that the water that one gets, the other one gets as well. And here we're seeing Portulacaria afra and aloe and other little plants around at the bottom. And this is a Lahmeyer, Encephaloartis Lahmeyer. In the shady parts, you get succulents like Bolane aloeoides. And one of the other habitats that really gave me inspiration was Hortus Hill. And it was full of rocks, full of plants, and everywhere you went, there was some unique thing to look at. And even though we were there for the cycad habitat, we were sidetracked by the succulents. And the plants are saying, don't step on me. Here we have the codex of Pachypodium. And we were actually walking through them for quite a while where we didn't see them and we were actually walking on them. Just blended right in with the rocks and other soft succulents, euphorbias. Here we have another euphorbia and a gasteria, along with some, what looks like to be dried sticks, but on the very ends there were leaves. Another area that had a lot of interest for us was Patchwood Farms in Stutterheim, East Cape, South Africa, the Potter's Ranch. And it's over a 4,000 acre parcel of land, including many different habitats.
Gary, someone's asked if you would take your cursor and see if it'll scroll across the screen. You can help point out the plants you're talking about.
Okay.
Good.
So one days on the hike out into the fields, we were looking for Encephaloartis caphra, and then we came across Huophany sticta, oops, and these other little succulents here, which I never did figure out what they were. They were almost the same color as the rocks and blended really in. We went to another canyon on the farm, and we encountered Allopharax, one of the euphorbias, Petragona, I believe, and Encephaloartis princeps. We were walking in all these ledges and edges that contain succulents of all types. This is one of the crassulas that was very prevalent in that region and found its way into every crack. And some of the things that were growing with it were asparagus ferns. And one other habitat we visited was the Latifrons habitat near Traps Valley. And this is a protected site. You can't share the location, but we went out to see the plants and their reintroduction of the latifrons that they're raising from seed from this population and putting it back into the wild. And along the way, we found Letiborias and a little Gasteria and some other pets. This is a South African grasshopper. Tim Gregory is the hand model. These rocks came from Lauren's garden, and when I talked with Jim at the beginning of the move, when we were taking out the companion plants to get ready to move the cycads, I said, do you want me to save everything in the garden? And he says, well, I'll leave it up to you. So being the hoarder I am, we took almost everything that we could and brought it back to the Huntington, knowing that we would reuse it in our interpretation of Lauren's garden. This is Palos Verdes limestone. Here we have the south of the art gallery, the beginning of the terraces in 2015. And then 2018, the construction of the rockery began. And by a stroke of luck, Forrest, the gentleman driving the Bobcat, had been in a stone yard and found more of these Palos Verdes rocks. We didn't know how many at the time, so we only bought maybe 10 or 12. And Jim liked it really well. It complemented the building, and he told us to go back and buy it all. So that's what we did. 220 tons later, this is the effect that it gave us for the Whitelock Garden Rockery, showcasing Lauren's favorite cycads. 2018 was also the year to add back in the companion plants that were saved from Lauren's garden, and we've added some choices of our own. We're looking at diunes and a transition of encephalartis. A little bit later, the plants, 5 years after the move, the plants are filling out. You can see succulents starting to creep into the picture. John has been very helpful in giving me suggestions of things to put in the rockeries. And actually the rockery gave me a lot of real estate to add winter bulbs, pelargoniums, aloes, euphorbias, and many, many other plants that come and go throughout the year. And it was Hortus Hill that gave me the inspiration to put this together. And this is what we look like today. So I guess where's the gardener is the caption for this picture. And that's it.
Thank you, Gary. We have an opportunity for a few question and answers.
I see one. Hello, Daddy, happy birthday.
Not for you, Gary, I guess.
Someone comments the mystery plant looks like Houston, looks like a Haworthia. Brian Kimball. And then comment, I've lost one Americana and 2 blow glows to weevils. How do I stop the spread? Who's got the answer for that?
What plants did they lose?
The Americana blue glows, I guess those are aloes maybe? William has written to weevils.
Maybe they're agaves.
Agaves, yeah, okay, agaves, yeah.
John, what are you doing in the desert garden?
There are systemics that can be applied, but certain species seem to be more susceptible than others. And usually it's the older mature ones, so you can often dig out the affected one and start over with a fresh offset.
Yeah. Carol writes, how often do you irrigate the new cycad garden? What is the duration of each cycle?
Currently, during the summer, we're watering once a week for 45 minutes. And all the other terraces are getting a 45 to an hour drip on their root zones. And I manually give them water. If we have an extra heat wave, I can manually do that from the clock. And then the system for the rockery normally goes off sometime in October. And then if it's needed, a manual watering.
Where is the garden located for some new members who haven't checked it out? So where on the property will they find this garden?
This garden is located south of the Huntington Art Gallery. It's a portion of our 3.5-mile Cycad walk that goes through many of the gardens here. And you can find it just directly south of the art gallery.
And Louise wants you to tell us, is the garden on drip or spray or a mixture, or what's the irrigation system there?
The rockery is just sprays, micromist heads in some areas and MP rotors in the others sections. And then the terraces, the Dioun terraces, and that middle bed are on drips, net FM.
Okay, I think we want to go ahead, but I see a couple more. What was the, and several artists with the pink flower spray in one of the earlier slides? I don't know if you can remember back there. There was a pink, that was, I think, the boom.
Oh yeah, I never did get a name on that one.
Yeah, okay. And then the big question is, was everything used up from Whitelock's garden?
Yes, it was all used, and it was merged not only into the Cycad garden, but it was merged into like the North Vista Camellia collection with the Clivias. A lot of it was merged into the Desert Garden collections. So Lauren's garden was put in many places throughout the Huntington.
Including the staghorn ferns up on the hill.
Correct.
Okay, Sean, I think we'll go ahead and we'll check these questions out later and get back to everybody, okay?
Okay. Thank you, Gary. Welcome, everyone. Today, I will be giving you a sense and sharing what the Huntington has been doing over its history in terms of vouchering and documenting our desert collection. We have a rich history of growing succulent plants over the last 113 years. And let's see if I can get into this. And by, for instance, looking at aerial photography that was done over the garden, this taken in 1924, we get a sense of what our collection looked like. And here you can note the reservoir, sometimes called the duck pond, that Henry Huntington would frequent at the lower section of the garden. And you can see the main portion of the garden. You also notice that the upper, which is now the upper garden, from the old world plants hasn't been built in 1924. In 1974, you can again look at the garden from an aerial perspective. Again, you can get your lay of the land by, this is the palm garden. And this is the main path. This is the main walkway going through the garden. The lower reservoir was filled, and now the garden has expanded. Also in 1966, they expanded the upper portion of the gardens. And in 2018, we get a sense of the garden as well. As it largely appears today, here's the Desert Conservatory, which was, I believe, built in 1984. But again, giving you a sense of how the collection has changed over time. And when you consider these, it's convenient to demarcate some eras over the course of our desert collection. And I've put those at the bottom of the screen here, 3 eras that might be helpful as we keep track of what's happened over the course of our desert collection. When you consider a snapshot of our accession book, for instance, from each of these eras, from 1924, from 1974, and from 2018, a pattern emerges, something becomes apparent, and that is the older a plant is, the less likely it is to be alive in our collection today. That's evidenced here by all of the dead stamps that you see, again, from this 1924 page. And so if we want to document and preserve this collection, we need ways of actively working with the collection so that when plants do leave the collection, as all plants eventually do die, we have some voucher or specimen of what the plant actually looked like while it was in our collection. Landscape photography was useful, so photo vouchers. And there are many of them from the early 1930s. And this is the lower southwest section of the garden from 1935. This is the Mammal Area Walk from 1947. It's showcasing one of the, what was then and probably still is, one of the longest cactus and succulent rockeries in the United States. It's along the main path, and it's very iconic with our desert garden. It still looks like this today, for those that have been to the desert garden. And even 1966, this is the year the upper gardens were opened, highlighting our old world collections. These landscape photographs are very valuable to us. They help us understand what the collections looked like at that time. But even more important are the individual photo documents of individual collections. Here on the left is Agave Celsii variety albicans, and this was the very first accession for our entire living collection. It's HBG1, number 1. It was the first accession plant we had, and that shows it growing in 1936. And here is Aloe candelabrum, accession 111. Parts of plants were also documented, and here we're looking at flowers and fruits from a cactus in the genus Cereus. These flowers were from Cereus, what was then called Cereus obtusus, which was given to our collection by the Britton and Rose, the Rose collection. So there was, the plant from which this came from was used in the book, Britton and Rose book, when they described Cereus obtusus. It's later been synonymized with another name, but yet they're important parts of our collection. Likewise, this was fruit from the type specimen of Cereus deamii, again, which has now been moved into Cereus stenogonus. Nonetheless, these vouchers are important. They were a method for us to study the collection. William Hertrick had a great interest in the genus Cereus, and this is Cereus huntingtonianus from 1936. That may be his wife in that picture, I'm not quite sure, but these photo vouchers, if you want to call them that, are really important. Up until 2007, you could use photos with the description of the type specimen. They had equal weight up until 2007 when describing a new species. In the early 1930s, we see our first dried plant specimens. And these were done by Dr. Bonnie Templeton. And she would go on to be the first woman botanist of the Los Angeles County Natural History Museum. And in the early 1930s, 1931 to be precise, she went around our collection and documented it. Remember, this was the same year that we accessioned our collection and surveyed our collection for the first time, and that was done by Eric Walther from Golden Gate Park in the California Academy of Sciences. So while he was creating an accession book and cataloging our collection, Bonnie Templeton was making actual vouchers, and some of those are of succulent plants and why they're included in this talk today. This is Haworthia cymbiformis, pressed in 1931. Crashula perforata, again, pressed that same year in 1931 by Bonnie Templeton. Fast forward to the second era, when Myron Kimnat came to the Huntington. He came to the Huntington in 1962, and a year later he founded our herbarium. So this is where we keep the dried specimens and photo vouchers and everything else that documents the living collection. It's located downstairs in the botanical complex, and it currently holds over 14,500 specimens. Of note is the amount of succulent species represented in this collection. Over 3,400 succulent plant specimens are in the collection, almost 24%. And that's going to include also spirit collections. That's when you take a plant and you put it into a alcohol preservative. Seed collections, synoptic seed collections for reference, and whole dried specimens, which are stored in large boxes. In addition, we have 165 type specimens, and we'll get to that in a second, but over 75% of those are of succulent taxa. And there's a picture of Myron Kimnack in the herbarium looking at a specimen he collected. And that's Epiphyllum, the genus Epiphyllum, which is a cactus. Myron was a real eminent botanist, a great man if you got to know him. And he did a great service to the Huntington by creating the herbarium. When you look at our herbarium and pay attention to all the succulent plants in it, this is how it breaks down with regards to the different types of succulent plants in our herbarium. And these are scientific names here we're using. And I'm using the old Cronquist system of classification. I understand that the aloe family is now in a separate family and the agave family is now recognized in a different family. But for purposes of this talk, this helps us understand just roughly how our collection breaks down. You'll notice it's very large in the cactus family, the Cactaceae, and in the stonecrop family, the Crassulaceae. This is important. In the wild, 1 out of every 3 cactus species is threatened. So as we move forward in the future, collections such as these, I believe, will take on greater importance. This is another graph, and this shows where the large succulent plant collections are held globally with a select group of herbaria I chose. Here we are. So the blue bars indicate the number of succulent plant taxa in the herbarium. You can see, of course, Paris, which is the largest herbarium on the planet, has over just about 40,000 specimens of succulent plant species. And then, of course, the National Herbarium of Mexico has a great amount as well. But the other bar or line we're seeing here in orange shows the percent of the collection that's dedicated to succulents. And so that's of note because very few herbaria actually have a large percentage of their collection dedicated to succulents. And as I mentioned, about 1 out of every 4 specimens in our herbarium is a succulent plant. The other notable item in this graph is the University of Zurich herbarium in Switzerland. They have a herbarium entirely dedicated to succulent plants. So every plant in their collection is a succulent. And they really set the gold standard for documenting and studying cacti and succulents from around the world. And they're a good role model for all of us. So how do you make a dried specimen from a succulent plant? There are some inherent challenges that are, I think, evident. What you need to do is make a dried, flat specimen out of a 3-dimensional juicy object, basically. So we need to remove all of this succulent tissue in the cortex of, for instance, this is a cactus, this is a cross-section, this is a stem of a cactus, this is Stenocereus montanus. And you have to remove all of this, and there are different ways you can do that. Some people put salt, just like if you were cooking, say, or preparing an eggplant to cook, and you'd put salt on the eggplant to draw the water out. Some people put salt on this to draw the water out. Some people put these in alcohol, ethanol for a period of time, again, to chemically take some of that water out. But I've found over the course of time that you can produce a good specimen, and this is the live plant, and this is actually a dried specimen underneath it, over here to the right-hand side of the screen. You can actually produce a good specimen simply by putting this in a plant dryer and then using blotters and various methods of applying pressure with heat and then constantly changing the blotters and the paper that get wet very quickly. And to make the process a little bit more clear, I did make a video for all of you, and we'll take a look at that. This is the process of pressing a cactus. This is Parodia ocampoi. We could just start this. So that's the plant, the living plant. That's also the living plant to give you a sense of the colors and what it looks like. You need a sharp knife, that's for sure, and you create a longitudinal section through the plant. You're careful to cut on either side of where the flowers are located. Once you've sectioned the plant longitudinally, you can see all of that succulent tissue. You remove it. I remove it with a knife, but you can even use, I've even used the melon baller in the past. Once you do that, shows some of that succulent tissue removed. Then it's a series of steps of adding various absorbent papers to draw out the moisture. That's a side view to show you how succulent it still is. Again, after a few days in the press, we take it out and remove more of that succulent tissue. And we're, again, adding paper and blotters every day, checking it frequently to remove all of that moisture that's built up. Get a sense of that it's drying out a little bit from the side view. And that's what it looks like after 7 days. Look how thin it gets. And at this point, you can actually, that's what it looks like. You can affix this to archival quality paper, glue it down. There's different glues you can use. We use Elmer's glue, but any different glues will work as an adhesive. Put on archival paper. You put a weight on it for about 48 hours. And then the finished product is this. You have a specimen that you've documented and preserved. And if you do this right and you've taken all the moisture out, this specimen can last hundreds of years. Maybe some of the color will fade, but nonetheless, you've captured the important characteristics of this cactus for future study. And because we didn't use alcohol, we didn't create artifact, we can actually take pieces of dried tissue from this plant and access the DNA for future studies as well, if we were willing to do a destructive sampling of this specimen. And in this method, we can take larger cacti and do the same thing. This is a barrel cactus, which we've all seen barrel cactus from the deserts. And with the same method, this was field collected by both Jim and Deb, the director and his wife, I believe in the early 1980s. So it shows the process can be done with larger cacti. And the process can be done with big juicy flowers, larger flowers as well. This is the Hylocereus undatus, the dragon fruit, comes from this plant. The flower is taking up most of the space on the page. This is a MacDougall collection. And this brings us to type specimens again. And one of the important roles of a herbarium is housing type specimens, and this is relevant to the field of taxonomy. So when a new name is applied to a species, a type specimen must be designated. And after that point, that specimen and the name are linked. And so there are different types of type specimens. The holotype, for instance, is the one specimen that best illustrates the new concept, that new name for the species. And isotypes and paratypes are other examples that support that new name when you describe a new species. And in some cases, when no holotype is designated, they have syntypes, which have equal weight. And in some cases, when it's ambiguous what the type whatever was, or if no holotype was ever designated, later on you can designate one as a lectotype or a neotype. Clonotypes are important. This is the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature does not recognize this category in parentheses here, but it's worth mentioning that many succulent plants that are in cultivation are clonotypes, meaning they're still living representatives of the actual species that was named, the actual plant that was named for that species. And we have many cases of this in our collection where we're still growing the type specimen. And to give you a sense of how this, you might call it a name game, works in taxonomy, we have in our collection the 1922 dried voucher that Dinter collected of Sarcophagophilus winklerianus, easy to say. This is a name that's no longer used. This is a milkweed, a succulent milkweed in the Sclipidaceae. And he sent this specimen to White and Sloan. And White and Sloan were based here in America, and they wrote a monumental work on the succulent Sclipidaceae. And about a decade later, they decided that this was in the genus Caralluma. And so this specimen still applied to the new name. Well, fast forward, Peter Brains more recently has studied this group, and Peter Brains was not aware of this specimen at the Huntington, and he ended up choosing a lectotype, a new specimen to go with his new concept. And he ended up using Stapelia mammillaris, was named by Linnaeus, but he resurrected the genus Quaqua, which Dr. Brown had created before him. And so a new type was associated with this name, again, because he was unaware of the presence of this specimen, which would have been in the White and Sloan archives here at the Huntington. And later he revised his concept of that to make this Ceropegia. So the point to all of this is that names change in taxonomy, and they will continue to change, particularly with succulent plants. But some of these specimens will always be linked to these old names. You can't change them. This is Echeverria Colorado variety Brantii, named after Fred Brandt. Some of you remember him. Myron named it after him. And the point here is all of our type specimens were digitized as part of a grant through the Mellon Foundation in 2011. Stephen Hammer sent us this plant in 2011, and it always makes me laugh when I see it. It's the smallest type specimen in our collection. That's right, it's about 7 millimeters in diameter. You have to be careful you don't confuse this with a piece of debris lying around in the herbarium. This is the type specimen for Conophytum bachellorum. So there's no size discrimination with type specimens. Some of the types in our collection have very interesting stories. This is a Puntia stenopetala. I ended up pressing this earlier this summer. And this plant was collected on the battlefield a year after the battle took place in the Mexican-American War, the Battle of Buena Vista. And the botanist Hosea Gregg was here a year after this battle took place and collected that plant. The plant ended up going to Spain and being grown in Spain for years, that clonotype. And then UC Berkeley got a hold of a cutting. And then we received the plant from UC Berkeley in the early 1960s. And we had been growing the plant, not aware that it was the clonotype specimen collected by Gregg, who also named the species. Some of the specimens in our collection are actually three-dimensional. We don't always make them flat and dry them to a sheet of paper. Some of our specimens are in boxes. This is Agave acatites, an inflorescence. This is a stem section of Euphorbia breviarticulata. This is a Lavranos and Newton collection. But again, there's value in keeping the three-dimensional specimen as well. This is housed in a rather large box in the herbarium. And of course, Welwitschia mirabilis. This is housed in a 4-foot-long box. But this gives you a sense of the type of objects we keep in our herbarium. This is a very unique gymnosperm. We keep a spirit collection. A spirit collection is when you put a plant into a preservative, an alcohol-based preservative. And here we're showing you 3 different tropical cactus flowers in spirit collection. So that big Hylocereus flower we saw earlier, we could have also put that in a spirit collection, and it just keeps the 3-dimensional structure intact when it's in fluid. We have ancillary collections like seed collections. This is a reference seed collection, and Gary just spoke about Lauren Whitelock and all the gifts he gave to the Huntington. And one of the things he gave us was a synoptic seed collection of every species of cycad he was aware of at the time. So we now have a reference seed collection for every cycad that's been named. And this is 2 trays showing you seeds for the genus Encephalartos. These are seeds for the genus Encephalartos. Again, that was a gift of Lauren Whitelock. Botanical illustrations are also parts of herbarium. Remember, before 2007, illustrations and photographs could be used for the type specimen. And so we keep these, and we have a large collection from the botanical illustrator May Bloss. And she worked closely with Myron Kimnack over the years. And I remember Myron telling me stories of her coming to the nursery at night, because a lot of these cacti open at night, and she'd get her ladder out and a flashlight and be there from like 12 a.m. till 5 a.m. drawing these beautiful sketches that were used in the species description. This is our first accession plant, remember, Agave Celsii, HBG1, but it's a cyanotype photograph. And this process was made famous by Anna Atkins, the British botanist of the 19th century when she studied algae. But the process can still be done today, and it's using sunlight to create an image. Here showing the leaves of our first accession plant. More recently, we've participated in global initiatives, and Dr. Brian Dorsey heads up this initiative. This is the Global Genome Initiative. And the point of this initiative is for there to be genetic material available for all the different genera of plants on the planet. So 1,000 different genera have been identified from the Huntington collections, meaning we will be the garden that provides genetic material on these genera. And one of them is a succulent. This is Pachycereus in the cactus family. And so this voucher accompanies a dried DNA piece that will be available to anyone who wants to access it for genetic studies, for genomic diversity studies. So we are moving towards dried tissue and DNA banking in the modern era. Thanks to other staff, this is largely due to Tim Tebow, curator of woody plants. All of our herbarium data was uploaded to SciNet. And this is the Southwest Environmental Information Network. And this means that all of our plants from the Americas can be found online, and you can get all the information and all the data there. All of the work we do is a collective effort. It's not just one person. And from 1986 to present, these are the staff members that have been involved in our herbarium. And these are the volunteers. And I'd like to point out Paul Myers in particular, who was instrumental in really helping us. One of the most dedicated volunteers I've ever worked with. And together we continue to grow the collection, and we continue this ongoing effort of documenting the collection. I wanted to say thank you. And we are approaching the fall season, so I thought it was fitting to show you that you can press a jack-o'-lantern if you so choose. And so this is Cucurbita pepo, and it's cultivar Harry Potter, because it does have that curious lightning bolt across the forehead. And with that, we can open it up to questions and answers, maybe with a little help.
Sean, we got a request for the redisplaying the program, the photo from Mammillaria Walk. It didn't appear on the screen. If you can go back into your show. And also, we got a misspelling. We'll fix it on your slides.
Okay.
There's an extra I in, let me go back and find it. I know that Alyssa's also watching this, so Alyssa, help me find that. It was from
agaveactitis.
Yeah.
Like, oh, sorry, yeah, that was it's icatites. Thank you.
Too many vowels, yeah.
Too many values, I appreciate that. Let me do this new share and share this. Why is it not letting me share that? Let me stop this one then, maybe.
You have to get out and get back in.
Yeah, I have to get out and get back in. Here's Mammillaria Walk. Can you see that? Can everyone see that? From 1947. kind of the centerpiece of our desert garden.
It's worth noting that in the last, when Joe Clements was here, we moved almost everything there and dug it out and put in fresh soil because things were breaking down, and so you don't just plant something and forget it. If you want to keep that as lush looking as that, you have to every couple of decades you have to take everything out and put in fresh, good draining soil and move ahead. Okay.
Thanks. Any other questions? No. Okay. So with that, I'd like to move on to our next speaker. And that will be Seth Baker, our garden's principal designer. He'll speak about his recent efforts in designing the new upper gardens of the desert garden.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Seth Baker. I'm Garden's principal designer, and today I'm going to be talking about what I'm calling making an entrance, and it's the desert garden headwaters here at the Huntington. So this project is really about creating an entrance that we've never really had with the desert garden before, and really formalizing that. So let's jump into the project goals here. So first, it's really just to make an entrance. And so something that really says, this is the desert garden. And then expand access. So open new areas to the public to showcase more of our collections. And then do it all in a way that follows ADA guidelines. Usually those just strictly apply to buildings, but so many of our visitors use strollers or wheelchairs, and so really the more enjoyable we can make it for everybody, the better off we are. Next, improve the garden, and so that's create a more immersive experience, increase opportunities for learning and interpretation, and improve horticultural conditions, as well as rehabilitate the desert conservatory and install all new infrastructure. And then ultimately, we really want this to kick off a renaissance in the desert garden. We've had unprecedented expansion in the gardens, and this is such a valuable collection and that we can really build on. So let's start with making an entrance. So first, we're looking at an aerial photo of the Huntington. The area highlighted here is the desert garden. And just, I want to get everybody oriented. So let's say you come in Oxford Gate, you go to the parking lot, or maybe you're coming from the north from Allen. You would then go into Barth Family Grove, and then down the alley of the California Garden. This is this morning, this is kind of the reveal you get at the end of that alley, looking across to that kind of majestic view over to the Huntington Gallery, the original mansion here. And as you look down, there's the seat wall down at the end, and this is the upper portion of the desert garden that you're looking at. And really, we want to announce this is it. This is an older rendering, but I think this can start to get you some sense of where we're going. I'm gonna just step back again. You have just that on the left of the screen here, that giant patch of bamboo that's really in your view when you come to the end on the right of the screen there. And then you're looking through to the palm garden in the background. And so as John Trager and I predominantly have been looking at the plants that we're going to use there, it's really kind of working on blending all of these different things into something that feels quite harmonious. And so some of the plants we're looking at here are the Pachypodiums, Alowadias, and of course, the Allobarbaries, the aloe trees. Next, looking at how we will expand access. So going to take a more global look here. So for years, Jim has been working on a pathway system that is all ADA compliant, that goes around the upper plateau of the property and really touches on a great deal of the gardens and something that's easy for just about anybody to negotiate. The trouble is there's a missing link there, and that's this space of the upper desert garden. Likewise, maintenance around the property, there's again a missing link there, and that's that upper portion of the desert garden. And so this will both complete this loop path that goes around for the public, but it'll also complete a maintenance loop that will help us take more maintenance traffic out of the core of the garden and push it to the perimeter. So we're going to be zooming in down here to the top of the desert garden. And so currently, well, you can see the fountain there and the pool at the bottom coming from the celebration garden at the bottom of the Education and Visitor Center. And currently now there's this path, little serpentine path that takes you down to the road, Desert Garden Road, and that then leads into the main path of the desert garden. And so again, there's really no formalized entrance. And so this is a look at how we're in the process of changing that. So this is a long circuitous path, because gosh, to my recollection, we have 34 feet between these 2 points that we need to negotiate. And in order to qualify as just a sloping path rather than a ramp, you're looking at a 1 in 20 grade. So that's, you're only losing 1 foot for every 20 feet of distance, which makes something very comfortable. So from there, that would link with that loop path going around the property to the main path going through the desert garden, and then another path that will then connect in with our universal access path that will eventually take us through the whole garden. Additionally, a steeper path, so one that would qualify as a ramp that is shorter and also just giving us some greater access to new collections. And then a patio will surround the conservatory. So I guess for those of you that aren't terribly familiar with the garden, that is the desert conservatory there. And so a new patio surrounding that, so that can accommodate school groups or small events, and really act as kind of an interpretive hub for the garden. And then a small amphitheater, again, for gatherings in its proximity to the conservatory, could make it quite useful. And then a series of stairs that just make quick links between these more circuitous paths. So this area indicated here is all expansion of the garden as far as what is accessible to the public. So it's really quite a significant area that we're opening up, some of it with well-established collections, and then things we'll be bringing in from the wings. So we're also going to be redoing the conservatory as a part of this, and this will be a quick walkthrough of what's anticipated there. This, again, is a little dated, and some of this has changed, but the overall thrust of it is still completely on point. So we'll strip down the conservatory to its most essential structural elements, make some new fenestrations through it, add retractable sides, insect screens, a polycarbonate roof, add new pathways around it and the patio that I mentioned, storage and a potting bench, and then a kind of superstructure over it that shade cloth can be applied to. So looking at some of the collections that we're getting, this is the most exceptional specimen of allodicotoma that I've certainly ever seen, and I've heard several people say the same. This is one of our longest term volunteers here at the Huntington, Sandy Chase. This is in her front yard, and she's been growing this for, gosh, I know at least 30 years to my recollection. But she's donating this to the Huntington. So that's a part of several gifts that are really kind of making this all possible. We're going to be taking a gift from the estate of Marge Richards to move this, and then, but it's also through the generosity of another anonymous donor, and also Ethan and Joanne Lipzig, who really have given, really made this whole process possible. And so now we want to look at some coming improvements. So this project really isn't so much about changing the garden as much as it is, you know, there's a really well-established kind of form language to this garden, and the main path, I think, really demonstrates that. So the rockeries on the side, and you can get the sense of this once having been awash, and you know, it's just such an iconic part of what makes the Huntington. And so I don't recollect what year it happened, but I do know the wash was partially filled in for the path at some point. And so I really wanted to just make this project more of an extension of what already exists and an amplification of it rather than something new. And so we're again looking at a rendering here of an aerial view, and look at how some of that plays out. So interested in that idea of a wash, and so really pulling it up all the way to the top of the garden and kind of letting that narrate the experience as you move through it. And then also kind of playing off of its relationship to the celebration garden fountain there just above it. So that will be like a flow line moving through the garden, and then have rockery around it to really help delineate the experience and have areas to show off all the collections that will be planted there. There of course won't be water running through it, but really a river of color that will hopefully help string your eye through the garden, and again help narrate that experience. Also different ways of using rock on the east side of the garden, then creating another wash that really kind of already exists, just amplifying it a bit out of native granite, and that would become contiguous with the heritage beds in the lower portion of the garden. So both of these are kind of these rock flows that will kind of string an experience through the entire garden. And then intermittently through the center of the garden, different sedimentary stones that will kind of soften transitions, and we'll also then have our 3 rock types represented: the igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. And for those of you that have been around for a long time, you'll recollect that the top of the desert garden used to have that beautiful aloe barberry forest, the aloe trees, and they, most of them have declined or died at this point, in large part because of armillaria, oak root fungus, and we've had heavy soils at the top of the garden, and so a lot of what we've been doing there is wholesale replacement of the soil, and so we will be recreating that aloe barberry forest and have some specimens that we've installed that we'll be looking at here soon. Right now. So we're at the end of the alley in the Brody, California garden on what is a rather grim day with smoke, but it really doesn't diminish that elegant view across to the Huntington Gallery and then the look down the Rogers Celebration Garden. As a part of this project, we have resculpted the slopes around the celebration lawn, incorporated cycads from the Whitelock collection, as well as the majority of the agaves that came along with that. As we approach the bottom of the garden, this is where we should really start to have that impact of the gates that really announce this is the desert garden. Recently we have craned into place a few different aloe barberries, and also I'm delighted that we were able to incorporate this lava rock that Gary Lyons had acquired years ago and just hadn't had the equipment or ability to place in the garden, and I think this takes great advantage of it. It's also, to my knowledge, the largest rock in the desert garden. It'll also serve as kind of the pinnacle from which all rockeries in the desert garden fall away from. And so you can see we have backfilled the seat walls here at the top of the garden, and that's so we can really display smaller things to great effect and put them closer to eye level. As we go through this threshold, also that buildup of soil should really allow us that relief from that compression once we get to this overlook here. These low-lying areas, all of the rock will be pushed to the sides and filled with colorful plantings like aloes that will be getting blooms throughout the summer or throughout the seasons. The berm here also is disguising the road on the other side to really make what's really the narrowest part of the garden feel much more incorporated. So once it's planted, we won't be looking at the lawn of the palm garden, and it will really turn into a borrowed landscape. The buttressing of that yucca, again, I think once we get some nice color beyond it, I think will really pull your eye into some nice deep views and really start to make things immersive rather quickly. I should say the chalk that is on the ground here indicates the eventual path. The sides of the path here will all turn into rockery edges. And as we move down, you can see that things start to get rather immersive rather quickly. A good deal of the buildings in the Education and Visitor Center have started to fall away, and really gets us to a good depth of experience. Again, one of the new aloe barberries there, making a focal point as we go through this hairpin turn. Great opportunity to incorporate some seating there. And since this is all supposed to appear like it's been sculpted by water and a wash, I think this is one of those areas where that will really start to come to life. As we get to the end of the conservatory here, you can hear that it's quite noisy and unattractive. This will be densely planted on the end, and the mechanical systems will be changed to where they'll no longer aurally affect this space. You can see the path. We have an option here to go to the left or to go to the right, and we're going to go to the right. So we'll keep descending into the wash, which continues to the right, but it also squares up with a conservatory here where we'll be putting new doors so you can walk through the conservatory on a daily basis and see the collections inside. There will be retractable sides, so also as you walk along the outside, you'll be able to see the collections. Here is where we will be planting Sandy Chase's massive Allodichotoma, which I think will be a beautifully prominent spot for it, where we have this perch that really gives you great prospect over the garden. And all of this new soil should keep it quite happy. So here's that perch, and behind me is the patio that will be for school groups, small gatherings, really kind of a place to do great interpretation for the garden. We're going to continue down now. Again, the path right about here. We'll be coming to a small footbridge, getting tangled up, that will reveal this second wash that goes through the garden. Currently our access road for construction, but it'll be made out of native granite that will be contiguous with the heritage beds in the lower portion of the garden. And so we'll really have two dominant rock flows going through the garden. The footbridge isn't just for fun, it's also to protect the root zone of this coast live oak, which we'll be using to hang and display a lot of our epiphytic cacti collection. The casita here is going to get relocated because the path will be going straight through here, and I'll see you on the other side. We make this turn, you know, we're still in close proximity to the conservatory, which is in part why we'll be incorporating a small amphitheater here, again made out of the native granite. And we have this fantastic Bacarnia that will function as a great anchor for the space. As we turn the corner here, really the path starts to get a little more generous and elegant, and kind of set the stage for the next portion of the garden. Again, here we'll be looking up that wash and also have a nice view of the small footbridge. And these nice, more gentle curves will give great spaces to create vignettes to really show off our collections to great effect. There'll be a small staircase here to our right that will take us back up towards the conservatory. And as we turn the corner here, this is where we'll join the original wash and main path. A relatively brief synopsis of everything we have going on in the desert garden, and I hope everybody can see the promise that it holds. It's, I think, a really exciting time, and I'm really thrilled to have the opportunity to be a part of this. I guess I can ask if there are any questions, and hand it back over to Sean.
Okay. I'm trying to answer the simple questions, but a lot of people, thank you, have written nice comments about how much they enjoy the garden and the garden being beautiful, and we love it. We of course are always looking at the problems and the disasters, but it's nice that people have a nice experience, and we appreciate all those comments. Seth, a lot of good comments on your photos that and your images, your graphics. So we're getting a lot of that. Question, will you use the meandering wash as a way to warm the garden during the winter? And I think that I'll let you think about that.
In certain instances, yes. We've tried to create John and I have been working pretty closely together on this, and really create a number of different microclimates, both looking at kind of seasonality and all the other factors that with the garden.
I saw one, somebody, the lava rock that was just installed, where had it been previously? I think they're talking about that big sunker.
It is big. So that just sat where it was delivered. I heard that the rock had been there for over 20 years, but it was just at the very bottom of the garden. It had been dropped off one day and just hadn't had the means to really get it out there.
Okay. Someone wanted a repeat, and I've lost it. Some simple questions. How many people might the amphitheater hold?
It's not fully detailed out, but it wouldn't be more than 25, 30 people.
A lot of questions about soil mix. I know that you guys brought in a new soil mix for this. So what's the soil mix for this project?
So we're using the John Trager Special, which is a equal parts forest humus, black scoria, and native soil, or black lava rock, and native soil.
Some people missed some of your streaming that people would, are we, I think we are recording this entire symposium. Is that true, Ben?
That is true. We are recording. And
yeah,
so if everything goes to plan, we should have it available for viewing next week. We'll be sure to let you know.
If you missed something and you want to go back and see it, you should be able to go into the live stream and then into the stream and then skip ahead and get to it. Okay. Sean, you want to go back to our last speaker here?
Sure. Our final speaker is John Trager, curator of the Desert Collections, longstanding employee of the Huntington. John, are you ready?
I am here, and I'm ready. Well, that was great, Seth, to see what we're doing down there. Can I help? Wonderful. Okay, so I am going to share screen, and there we are. Okay, so welcome to the land of fire and smoke. These are a couple of pictures taken in the last month. The one on the left was taken 5 days ago, and that's the Bobcat fire, when you could see the plumes of smoke rising. They've now descended onto the San Gabriel Valley in a thick pall. And on the right is the lake fire that's a little bit further to the east from a couple of weeks ago, when it was resurging and creating a spectacular cloud of smoke. Yet, let's see if advance will work. There we are. Life goes on, and actually a lot has been happening here, as you can gather from prior presentations. And what I've done is put together some highlights of things that have happened in 2020, at least as seen through my eye and my phone camera. And I'm I've whittled it down to about 800 images. So we'll be here a while. No, just kidding. It's actually a little less than that. And we'll try to get through this in a reasonable amount of time. Also, I thought I would organize this around an answer to a question that I frequently hear, and that is, what do you do all day? Or put a little more delicately, perhaps, what's a typical day like, or what does a curator do? So we'll address three aspects of that. First and foremost, I'm a horticultural curator and a horticulturist, so we are involved in working with the plants on a daily basis, watering and weeding and fertilizing and propagating. So here, for example, is a specimen that we received from the Tegelberg collection in 1992 of Astrophytum ornatum, a fantastic 5-foot-tall specimen. And it's a wonderful plant, but it does have a little bit of a tendency to scar at the base. So since we've received this plant, we've cut it and rerooted it a couple of times, trying to get cleaner growth. And here is one of those cuttings. It's not every day you get to take a 4-foot cutting of an Astrophytum ornatum, but it didn't seem to set it back at all. It's flowering nicely, and it eventually was stood up in a pot after it had calloused for a good long while and took root. Just a detail of the beautiful chevron pattern of trichomes on the ribs of this plant, which are usually denser and variable depending on the clone. But here are some specimens out in the desert garden where it also does quite well, though not to quite the same heights as the conservatory specimen. Of course, with 10 acres of desert garden and 20,000 square feet of nursery space to maintain, I couldn't possibly do all this myself. So I'm very grateful to have assistance of nursery staff, Susan McDonald, Karen Zimmerman, and Alyssa Ferrier, who helps with labeling and records keeping, as well as desert garden crew, which ranges from 3 to 6 on a good day, under the capable head gardener management of Agathe Fontaine. We currently have Massimo D'Alessio, Faustino Benitez, Jeff Deans, and Salvador Melgosa. And so you may see these people working in the garden when you visit. And certainly not to be left out are the volunteer staff who work with us week in and week out, most of the year, and without any monetary compensation. So we really appreciate the efforts of Sandy Chase and Miguel and Barb Hall, among many, many others. So there's lots of opportunity to collaborate as well with our colleagues and coworkers. Dylan Hannon, for example, our curator of tropicals, is a master propagator and very good with adenias in particular. And Adenia lapiazicola, this rare Madagascan species, we never had enough of for an ISI distribution, but Dylan has been nurturing these along and has pollinated them. And here you can see the female fruit developing on the left and the male flowers on the right. So we may yet be able to offer this through ISI. Another one that we did offer through ISI some years ago is this wonderful terrestrial orchid, Aecioclades spathulifera. It has this very cryptic coloration that looks like a gaboon viper. It's flowering recently in the conservatory, a couple of clones. So my coworker, our orchid specialist, Brandon Tam, was able to pollinate and get fruits that should give us a whole new crop. Now, we also do some design in the garden, and Seth and I maybe experienced a little bit of rock envy when looking at the levitated mass, this installation at the LA County Museum of Art. So we had to have some big rocks too. And this is the big one that he showed, brought up from the lower desert garden. And Shadi orchestrating the moving here. Here's Seth practicing his levitating skills. But actually we did need to bring in the 100-foot crane to place this rock and the big aloe barberries that you see. Meanwhile, design has been going on all the while throughout the garden, but on a smaller scale perhaps. But one area that we did a couple of years ago that's really come into its own this year is bed 6, where there was a massive clump of Puya chilensis that you see in the background, forming that thicket there with its club-shaped inflorescences of chartreuse flowers. This plant was growing out over the path and threatening to grab visitors to supplement its nitrogen. So we took a little bit of it out on this corner and added in a new Puya species, namely that silvery one in the foreground, Puya gilmartinii, which is related but slightly more diminutive relative of Puya chilensis. And for complements, we have the red-flowered Aloe debrana and the pastel orange Aloe Goldilocks, Aloe Cameranii hybrid. And Carpobrotus acinacifolius to knit it all together, which is on this year's current ISI offering. Another Chilean bromeliad we hope to get into the garden in some point in the future is Okagavia carnea. And another little bit of design work is on Aloe Hill, which is an iconic view at the Huntington when it's in full color, which is for about 3 weeks in the winter. But to add a little more year-round color, we've added some repeat blooming Aloe roicope in the foreground, and there's more to come in the midground of different flowering aloes. Some of the more dramatic views of Aloe Hill are actually from non-public areas, but maybe someday we'll be able to develop public path work so that you can see these. Research is another aspect of curation, and while we don't do a lot of high-tech scientific research ourselves, we certainly collaborate with any number of researchers who utilize our collections. Here, for example, Todd Michael is working on gene expression in Welwitschia, and he's holding the female cones that he has harvested on the left here. And another plant that he sampled tissue of in the past, and nothing that he did, but unfortunately the plant was senescing and dying back. Let's go back. But it had a little remnant of green tissue, so we decided that he should take that for further DNA sampling, and then the carcass will come back to us for our herbarium. We also try to keep up with the literature on succulents and changing taxonomy. This is one that you might know better as Agave gypsophylla, has been renamed as part of reordering of the Agave marmorata group. So this is Agave Pablo Carrillo-i. It has beautiful orange flowers. And Agave marmorata still exists, and it tends to have a rosette that cants to one side or another, and here the whole inflorescence is leaning. Also in the literature recently was this new genus described after Myron Kimnack, which seems very appropriate given all of his efforts in research and taxonomy of the epiphytic cacti. This is a plant that was first known as Ripsalis ramulosa and Disocactus ramulosus and Pseudoripsalis ramulosus, but is now Kimnackia ramulosa in recognition of its very distinct DNA signature. And we're very interested in documentation, so different than just a backyard collection, we're very interested in the data associated with the collection of our specimens. And here, for example, is what may be one of the perhaps because people don't have room for a big spiny thing like this, but it's an Ecuadorian plant which helped us determine that it was indeed subspecies diffusus of Pre-Cereus euchloris. So this is one that we'll be working up for ISI in the future. And this is an example of the sort of labeling that we're trying to implement on the entire collections. We have a long way to go, but with 5 lines of type, we can put in a lot of information, starting with the botanical name, Second line has our accession number and other pertinent numbers, in this case, Bill Baker's collection number, date of collection, and locality, and elevation at which it was collected. And there's lots of other information that doesn't usually fit on a label that we keep in the database, including aspect and slope, soil type, geology, etc., and associated flora. And also you'll notice we put the accession number across the top of the label for easy reading. So some of the documented plants we have in the gardens, Agave bracteosa put on a particularly good show this year. And this happens to be an old accession grown from seed collected by David Verity in Huasteca Canyon. Now we don't know if it's this population in particular, but this is a population of Agave bracteosa in Huasteca Canyon that grows in a rather different situation than in our garden. Agave perii truncata is a gentry collection, and this may be the type actually. We have this interspersed with the golden barrels in bed 5, where it makes quite a dramatic display. And I'm always looking for optimal lighting and situation to get a good photograph. And this year I got a pretty good one of this bicolored inflorescence, complemented by the Tacoma in the background. Another aspect of documentation is surveying the garden so that we know exactly what we have and where and what condition it's in. And this plant, Agave salmiana in bed 26, is pretty hard to miss, you would think, but curiously, our database has no record of an agave in bed 26 in this position. So hopefully, when the plant is done flowering, we'll remove this rosette and find an old label of some sort, and we'll have to accession it anew if it hasn't been already. Another thing to watch out for is flowering events. Aloadia humbertii we recently put out in the garden, and it has done quite well despite its Madagascan origins. It's proved hardy enough in our climate. And in the Didieriaceae, it has betalain pigments, just like the cacti and the mesams, which you see evidenced here in the brightly colored stamens. Here's another example of a well-documented collection from Myron Kimnack's et al.'s expedition to Bolivia in 1984. So this is one we'll be working up and distributing. Echinopsis leucantha is one of the more subdued nocturnal flowering species, but with a beautiful symmetry and ring of stamens. Other Echinopsis are much more colorful, including the hybrids like Mark Dimmitt's Apricot Glow and the old hybrid Glorious, hybrid of Echinopsis huasha. So brilliant that it's really hard to make out the detail in those flowers. The Schick hybrids also have made it out into the garden in some places, but most of them are back in the nursery where we've been struggling with some fungal infestations. We're trying to get a handle on it. We now know what the fungus is. It belongs to the genus Cercospora, and we've found fungicides that might help in controlling it. But certain individual cultivars that have been slow to propagate or particularly affected by this fungus, like Echinopsis candlelight, we've decided to put inside and graft some specimens. And what you'll notice here is that we've taken an offset and grafted it onto a stalk, and the bottom of that offset has been turned upside down and grafted in an inverted position. But you see that after a month or so, it's already putting out offsets, and a couple months later, they're doing quite well. So we're on our way to restoring that one. And here's a view of the Schick compound this last spring with all of the Schick hybrids on these first 2 benches. And on this closer bench is a new batch of hybrids, the last seed batches that Bob Schick left with us that we're working on selecting from, the ones worth naming and giving cultivar names and distributing. Okay, now a few highlights in the garden. We recently redid this bed with Alocampari cornuta, which is a dependable March flowering aloe, which is used in a couple of places in the garden. Aloe sabea is affectionately known as the runway aloe because of its tall, leggy, model-like stature. We've tried to pollinate this one. Of course, if we don't do anything, the hummingbirds will pollinate them for us. The problem is they'll bring in pollen from all sorts of other species and we'll end up with a bunch of hybrids. So we have to bag these flowers in order to pollinate and get true seed. Here's a future ISI offering, Bilbergia colemanii, beautiful banded foliage. This is actually an epiphyte from Bolivia. Micranthosceras purpureus has a very animated look when it's coming into flower. And cleistocacti are also favorites in the garden. And isn't this the most adorable cleistocactus you've ever seen? Very huggable. This plant made quite a splash when it was discovered and described about 15 years ago now, the monkey's tail cactus. It's now been merged under Cleistocactus winteri, subspecies Cola limono, the monkey tail, literally. And it was inevitable that somebody made a cross, and this is one that I did with the other Hilda wintera species, the yellow spined one. And it's not quite as hairy as I had hoped for, but the yellow spines seem to dominate, but maybe it'll develop some hair as it develops. And other people have done this cross as well, namely Kelly Griffin, and his seems to have a bit more long hair in it. Here's another hybrid of mine that shows more erect stature by virtue of the Cleistostraussii parentage, so hopefully that'll be a good addition to the garden. Cotyledon barbii is a widespread plant and therefore quite variable. This is an unusual pale flowered form collected in Ethiopia that we'll be propagating. And this one you may have seen in cultivation, the Crassula multicava form with the red undersides. It actually has a cultivar name, Ungabara, that Ernst von Jaarsveld gave to it based on the locality where it was found. Speaking of crassulas, this is either a native species or the Mediterranean introduction, Crassula tilia, which is usually quite a miniature plant here growing quite lushly in a sandy location down in Oasis Nursery down in San Diego County. Echinocereae flowered quite well this year, including Moringea or Echinocereus pensilis, and Echinocereus pentalophus has wonderful variations, some with paler laciniate petals, others much lusher looking with denser emerald green stigmas. More Echinocereae. This one has a flower that looks for all the world like an Echinocereus, but you might not know it from the very slender stems, which is why it used to be called Wilcoxia pulselgeri. We've been experimenting with a couple of euphorbias out in our outdoor sunbed in the nursery, and this Euphorbia mammillaris has done particularly well, as has Euphorbia valida, which develops an incredible bush of thorns, peduncular thorns, that envelop the whole plant practically. We also are experimenting with various xeric orchids to see how they tolerate succulent culture. And this one from the West Indies, Tetramicra canaliculata, looks vegetatively like a Sansevieria, but here are the flowers to prove its orchid affinities. Phaerocacti are great summer flowers in the garden. And on an overcast day, the flowers may not open fully, although the lighting is good. But when they do open fully, the pollinators come like this halictid bee and little nitidulid beetles. Tacitus bellus is a favorite name among succulent collectors, and I think it's going to stay, even though botanists have lumped it into Graptopetalum as Graptopetalum bellum, but it doesn't lack the spotted petals after which the genus is named. So there's another good reason to retain that original name. Also opened this year, you might not have seen yet, is the Horticultural Pavilion north of the Children's Garden, where we'll be hosting plant sales in the future. So I hope you'll get to visit that soon. On an overcast May day, or was it June maybe, we had good flowering of Edithcolia grandis and Secotrin collection. So we put it outside for the flies to pollinate. And Hoodia Gordoni. This is one was famous as the reputed diet drug in years past. Not sure how well it works. Maybe it just tastes so awful you lose your appetite. But I actually had a botanical medicinals company send me a sample that they wanted identified to confirm that it was Hoodia Gordoni. And they were cross sections of stems that looked superficially like Hoodia, but they were actually Echinocereus. So not sure how that would do you for your diet plant, but. And another stapeliad, we've been introducing a couple of hybrids of Huernias, which actually are really good performers, a little less prone to rot than a lot of other stapeliads. Huernia foma was one we introduced a few years ago. And here's a new one, a sibling of it, called Fringe Benefit. And if you look very closely, you'll see why this is different. Typically, Huernias have a pointed, 5-pointed annulus that alternates with the petal points. In this case, the main points of the annulus are opposite the petal points. So that's kind of an interesting variant. So we'll be offering that at some point. You might question whether we need another mother of thousands in cultivation, but this is the type collection after all. So we'll probably be introducing Kalanchoe sanctula, which forms little bulbils on the leaf margins, and it has such pretty flowers. Lampranthus productus is a commonly cultivated species, and this one has a dribbling of flowers in July in these photos, but it's primarily flowering in February, and you can see this thing from outer space practically. Actually, this is the aerial view of the Huntington, and you can see a patch of it there and another patch down in Aloe Hill. Here are a couple of iconic plants vying for attention, Yucca folifera and Lampranthus aminus, which certainly steals the show when it's in flower. We do aim to provide an immersive experience, and some visitors take advantage of this. The problem with some of these Lampranthus is that they reseed themselves. Maybe it's not a problem when you get something like this. This is a particularly dense flowered pink spectabilis form, similar to Pink Betty that Joe Clements named some years ago. Blinding. Mammalia recoilectocantha is from a road in Oaxaca that I've traveled, but unfortunately haven't seen. Maybe they all got collected. But fortunately, we have a couple of clones in cultivation, so we can get some seed and propagate this one vegetatively because it has such nice yellow spination. And ISI is an opportunity to propagate plants that have been in our collection for a while, like this Perodia iopayana, and distribute them more widely, as well as a way to drive collections development. So new things that come into our collections, we always save some for the collection as well, like this Matricana tuberculata from Wolfgang Kron collection. Having visitors come who know certain groups of plants is very handy. Director of a South Carolina Botanic Garden came through and knew this Opuntia, which we'd been growing for many years, and maybe you know it as well, but haven't had a name for it. It has this very prominent venation that shows through the pale pads. This is Opuntia gomi. Old Mexico. Opuntia kimilo is a common South American species with long toothpick-like spines. Comes in shades of orange, beautiful color. And Pachyserius marginatus, the pipe organ cactus, comes in different color forms. Parodias, or nodocactus subgroup, are typically this beautiful satiny yellow with bright red stigmas. Here we have Peneus cereus. It can make a nice caudex, although they're a little bit rough when they're exposed and they tend to shrivel a bit. Here's a puya we'll be propagating, a magnificent Argentine species from the Chaco region that has these very dense trichomes lining the margins of the leaves, although the flowers are fairly nondescript. Here's a Rubutia marsoneri we grow in the conservatory, the flowers concealing what's going on underneath. We may have to graft that one up and propagate it. Rhombophyllum delabriforme is common in cultivation, but it's nice to have documented collection. This is from Rava seed. We may need to propagate that too for distribution. Here's a nice little rockery stuffer in the garden. And various conservatory species or smaller ones that might get swamped by more vigorous plants outdoors. The Schwantesia succumbens has beautiful leaf architecture. Sempervivums, we are testing the heat tolerance of certain various cultivars, and this one's done quite well and seems to be more mealybug resistant than some sempervivums, perhaps by virtue of the hairs on the leaves, and they have such interesting flower morphology and color patterns. Senecio pyramidatus is one we've grown in the conservatory for many years, and I actually noticed it at the bottom of one of Gary's Cycads slides, so we can identify that. It has typical daisy flowers and these long finger-like leaves covered in felty, silvery felt. Occasionally we have other sports in the collection that are of note. Sulcorubutia caniguralii is typically this bicolored red and yellow, but here's some striped flowers appearing on this one. Don't know if it'll be persistent, but we'll be watching that one. Speaking of Sulcorubusias, we have quite a good collection of those, and I've always been interested in them over the years. Here's an old ISI introduction of the green form of Sulcorauschii, and one that we have yet to introduce of Sulcorubusia patriciae, or subspecies patriciae. And we have an interest in sulcos because many of them came in from the 1984 Bolivian expedition, and that helped us develop a relationship with a Sulcorubusia collector in Pennsylvania, Paul Hoffman, who recently retired to Alabama, and that climate was not to the liking of the Sulcorubusias. So he called me up one day and asked if I'd like all of his seedlings. He said he had about 600 seedlings to donate. So I said, sure, why not? And they're doing very well out in our shade house. And a couple of weeks later, he called and said, well, I'm going to send you the whole collection too, not just the seedlings. So we have lots of magnificent Sulcorubusia populations or collections here, most of them very well documented, that we'll be introducing in future years. A couple of tephrocacti in the conservatory. Wonderfully delicate flowers coming out of these interesting spiny stems, and so forth. And lastly, winding down here, a beautiful Yucca carnerosana flowered this year, as did Yucca whippleyi, subspecies of Remica, perhaps better known as Hespero yucca nowadays, but there you have it. And the days are getting shorter and the nights are cooler, so we'll soon be having winter growers pop up like some of the oxalis. We have a big collection of oxalis thanks to our former curator, Michael Vassar, and so many of them have MV numbers. But we're being very careful about propagating and distributing these because they might prove to be very invasive, like the common Oxalis pescapri. And in particular, we're leery of these that I'm calling the divers, which grow out the bottom drain holes of the pots and crawl into other pots. And the pelargoniums will be flowering as winter comes on. And it's fun to look at the winter flowering bulbs in Gary's Cycad rockery. He's got some really interesting Ferrarias, for example, and Lachenalia aloides. Other Lachenalias we have back in the nursery, like Lachenalia hirta with its beautiful bluish inflorescence and interesting banding on the base of the leaves. And various winter flowering mesems in the conservatory. Both these specimens are about 35 years old, so these can be very long-lived container plants, as is this one, Gibeum pilosity. And Kethlophyllums do well out in the garden. They're crawling plants, but not quite as rampant as Carpobrodus, but there's some wonderful flower forms to be selected here for use in the garden. And I'll leave you with a scene that harkens back to the past at the top of our north end of our ranch, and a more peaceful and quiet time of the past. So thank you very much.
Okay. Sean, I'm going to turn over to you for a second. And Alyssa, you've been paying attention to. I fielded a lot of the questions. We will get back to people with, some people want more specific information, book titles and things. We'll try to get back to you on all of that. Please write us if you don't get a satisfactory answer. Brian has written some nice notes for you, John. One of the Thelocactus had Monclova as the location. This is the typo from Monclova. So just, okay.
Great, thank you.
So people are paying attention. Will more of Mike Vouse's oxalis be available to the public? I think we've always been afraid to introduce a lot of oxalis of fearing we'd get in trouble, but they are spectacular.
We have introduced a couple of the less rampant ones, and Michael himself shared many of them with Telos Bulbs, bulb nursery, specialty nursery in the past, so they may still carry some of them as well. But I would caution you against putting any of those in the garden in Southern California. Keep them in containers.
Okay, I'm gonna turn it back over to Sean. I've kind of scanned over them, but anybody who's got questions, please send them in and we'll get back to you. From my viewpoint, thank you all for joining us. We still have 313 participants after a full 2 hours when we only promised you an hour and a half. So thank you very much. Sean, you want to finish up here?
I just wanted to say thank you to all the presenters and thank you for all the attendees. We did go a little bit over, but I'm really happy that we could continue to provide this event in the remote format. If you have questions that haven't been answered, we're happy to field them. We can provide contact information for you to reach out to us, and we can give you more in-depth explanations for any of those questions you might have when we have more time. I think that's it, though. We've gone 2 hours. I think it's time to.
I want to thank Ben.
Yes, thank you, Ben Tuttle.
Ben, thank you very much for making this work for us. It's been a great
pleasure.
And just to remind you all, we're here. We're still working. We've made it through. We're going to survive. And the Chinese garden opens to the public in less than a month. And so make your reservation and come on out and visit us. And a lot of people ask Seth, when are we going to finish this project? And I've been saying within a year, I hope within a year, next year sometime, we're working on it. So that'll be the next big thing to happen for us is the completion of the top of the desert garden. And that's exciting, just as exciting as the Chinese garden project. So thank you all. And I think we'll let you go now. Have a nice evening and a nice weekend and avoid the fires.